His days unfolded like the perfectly indexed card catalogues Protagonist meticulously maintained, each moment filed, cross-referenced, and predictable. Protagonist was a guardian of forgotten histories, a quiet sentinel in the hushed halls of the municipal archives, where the dust of centuries settled on parchment and the scent of aged paper was a comforting balm. His world was one of order, of facts, of the concrete. Emotions were messy, narratives often embellished. Protagonist preferred the stark clarity of a tax ledger or a birth certificate. This particular Tuesday, the precise rhythm of his existence was shattered by the arrival of a thick, cream-colored envelope, its weight an anomaly against the usual flimsiness of utility bills and junk mail. The return address, embossed in an old-fashioned script, bore no name, only the crest of a legal firm Protagonist did not recognize. Inside, the solicitor's prose was as dry as the crumbling deeds Protagonist handled daily, yet its message landed with the force of a falling tome. His great-aunt, a distant relative Protagonist barely recalled, had passed, and in her passing had bequeathed to him Blackwood Manor. Protagonist reread the sentence, his brow furrowed. The name itself felt like a misprint, an anachronism in his otherwise modern life. The accompanying photograph, a sepia-toned relic, depicted a sprawling stone edifice swallowed by overgrown ivy, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath a heavy, slanting roof. The manor was a hulking silhouette against a sky that seemed perpetually bruised. There was a quality to the light in the photograph, a leaden pallor that made the very air around the structure seem heavy, stagnant. Local lore, briefly mentioned by the solicitor's accompanying notes, hinted at a history steeped in odd occurrences, strange disappearances, and a general air of ill fortune. Superstitious nonsense, Protagonist decided, the kind of rural gossip that clings to any old, isolated house. His great-aunt, Protagonist vaguely remembered, had been an eccentric recluse, and this desolate monument to her solitude was a fitting, if inconvenient, legacy. An inheritance, the solicitor had droned over the phone, his voice devoid of inflection. Carries certain responsibilities, Mr. Dean. He spoke of taxes, upkeep, and the considerable distance to the nearest town. Protagonist listened, his mind already calculating the logistical nightmare. This wasn't a windfall, it was a burden, a final duty to an ancestral line I had long considered irrelevant. My plan crystallized quickly. I would go, sort through the inevitable clutter, arrange for an estate sale, and offload the property as swiftly as possible. Blackwood Manor would be a temporary disruption, nothing more. The drive was long, the landscape slowly shedding its familiar contours. Highways gave way to winding country roads, then to narrow, unpaved tracks hemmed in by ancient gnarled trees whose branches laced together overhead, forming a perpetual twilight. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the damp scent of loam and decay. My phone's signal flickered, then vanished altogether. The silence that descended was not peaceful, but vast, expectant. When I finally saw it, rising from a tangle of unkempt wilderness, Blackwood Manor was even more imposing than its photograph suggested. It loomed, a jagged silhouette against a sky bruised purple with the approaching dusk. The stone was dark, almost black, scarred by centuries of weather. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snaked across its facade, prying at mortar, obscuring windows like bandages over ancient wounds. No light emanated from its many panes, only the dull reflection of the fading sky, giving the impression of watchful, unblinking eyes. A wrought iron gate, rusted and half open, hung crookedly, groaning softly in the faint breeze. This wasn't just an old house. It was a presence, a vast, sleeping thing. I pushed the thought away, blaming the long drive, the isolation. It was just a house, albeit a remarkably dilapidated one. The front door, a massive slab of oak studded with tarnished iron, yielded with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten potpourri mixed with the metallic tang of old blood. My breath plumed in the frigid air. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of light piercing the grimy windows. To my left, a magnificent, if severely neglected, grand staircase curved upwards. The stairs creaked, each groan a complaint from the ancient structure. I tried one, then another, finding them locked or jammed. Venturing deeper, I found myself in a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors. I was looking for the master bedroom, or at least a room that seemed less likely to collapse. Turning a corner, I encountered a particularly peculiar architectural feature: a narrow secondary stairwell that looped back to the same landing I had just left. I paused, a frown creasing my brow. It was an odd design choice, a redundant path, seemingly serving no purpose but to return one to where they had begun. I traced the curve of its banister with my eyes, a sense of mild disorientation settling over me. It was illogical, inefficient, an anomaly in a building that, despite its decay, had clearly once been designed with grandeur in mind. I shook my head, dismissing it as another quirk of an eccentric owner. This place was already proving more troublesome than I had anticipated. The sun had completely set now, and the manor was plunged into an inky blackness, save for the weak beam of my flashlight. My practical plan for a quick exit already felt like a distant dream. The polished mahogany of the municipal archives, once my anchor, had given way to the gnawing chill of the road. I had traded the predictable scent of aged paper for the damp earth and decaying leaves that clung to the winding track. Each mile deepened the isolation, the world receding behind me like a forgotten index card. The solicitor's directions, crisp and impersonal, had led me through a landscape that grew progressively wilder, until only skeletal trees, their branches clawing at a bruised sky, stood sentinel. Then, through a sudden break in the gnarled woods, it appeared. It did not stand. It loomed. A leviathan of blackened stone and crumbling mortar, its silhouette jagged against the gray canvas of the afternoon. Turrets, like broken teeth, pierced the sky, and rows of vacant windows stared out with an ancient, unblinking malice. Ivy, thick as a wrestler's arm, throttled one entire wing, pulling it further into the earth's embrace. A profound quiet, heavy and ancient, seemed to emanate from its very walls, swallowing the crunch of my tires on the gravel drive, muffling even the beat of my own pulse. I stepped from the vehicle, the sudden silence a physical weight. The air, thick with the scent of wet stone, mildew, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old blood filled my lungs. The gate, a rusted lacework of iron, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. This was not merely an old house. Ite tomb, breathing. The massive oak door, weathered to a pale, bone-like gray, yielded with a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my teeth. A grand hall stretched before me, a mausoleum of faded grandeur. Light, weak and watery, filtered through grimy, leaded windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like lost souls in the gloom. Cobwebs, thick and gray as ancient shrouds, draped every surface, connecting chandeliers to banisters, paintings to cornices. My footsteps, usually precise and muted, rang out with an almost insolent loudness on the decaying parquet, the sound swallowed by the cavernous space. I ran a hand over a nearby table. A fine, gritty film clung to my fingers. The pervasive damp had left its mark, too, blooming across wallpaper in blotchy patterns, softening the edges of once sharp carvings. I began a cursory exploration, my initial cynicism warring with a nascent, unsettling curiosity. Each room I entered a tableau of abandonment, furniture shrouded in white sheets like ghosts awaiting resurrection, or left exposed to the elements, their fabrics bleached and frayed. The house unfolded in a confusing, almost deliberate labyrinth, I found myself ascending a sweeping, spiraling structure, the stairwell that loops back to the same landing, twice before realizing its strange, disorienting design. It felt less like an architectural flourish and more like a deliberate trick, a way to keep one from ever truly gaining their bearings, to foster a sense of being perpetually lost. A section of wall at the very end of a narrow, forgotten corridor, tucked away behind a moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene. I ran my hand along the cool, smooth wood, feeling for a catch, a release. My fingers found it, a tiny, almost invisible button, disguised as part of the grain. With a soft click, the panel swung inward, not on hinges, but sliding back into the wall with a breath of ancient, confined air. The faint, sweet-sour tang of old paper, leather, and something else, something sharp and metallic, yet also organic, like dried herbs or crushed bone assaulted my senses. This was not merely another abandoned chamber. A single, dust-choked window offered a sliver of light, illuminating a massive, claw-footed desk laden with more documents, some spilling onto the floor in cascades of yellowed parchment. My archivist's heart, despite the growing unease that prickled at my skin, gave a reluctant, almost involuntary leap. This was the true inheritance, far more potent than the decaying structure around it. This was the history, locked away, waiting to be catalogued, to be understood. The gnawing chill of the Thed given way to the clothed silence of Blackwood Manor's grand archive, a chamber I had sought with a strange mix of dread and anticipation. It was not the chaotic jumble I'd half expected, but a meticulously arranged mausoleum of paper and ink. Towering shelves, carved from a wood so dark it seemed to absorb the meager light, lined every wall, laden with volumes bound in leather, vellum, and rough linen. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, a faint, earthy sweetness, like dried petals or forgotten spices, settled heavy on my tongue. Dust motes danced in the shaft of weak afternoon sun that pierced a high, leaded window, illuminating a grand, scarred oak table at the room's center. This was where Protagonist would begin. Protagonist pulled out a heavy wooden chair, its joints groaning in protest, and began to work. The initial ledgers were tedious. Inventories of land, records of obscure transactions, lists of servants long turned to dust. His fingers, accustomed to the smooth, thiest paper of municipal documents, felt clumsy against the brittle, yellowed leaves that crumbled slightly at his touch. Then the narrative began to twist. Protagonist found a series of leather-bound journals, their covers embossed with a stylized, unsettling symbol, a swirling vortex that seemed to draw the eye inward. The handwriting, though varied across the volumes, shared a peculiar, almost obsessive neatness. Meticulous descriptions of the Manthe instruction gave way to cryptic notations about ley lines and telluric currents. His cynicism, a comfortingly familiar shield, remained largely intact. Eccentricities of the lanthon tree, Protagonist decided, perhaps a dabbling in geomancy. But then, a new phrase began to appear with increasing frequency, scrawled in a delicate, almost reverent hand. The binding. It was always capitalized Waces set apart, later in a different, more forceful script. The cycle emerged, often accompanied by complex, almost architectural diagrams that seemed to map not structures, but energies. A shiver, faint as a spider's silk, traced its way up my spine. I pushed the thought away, focusing on a particularly unsettling illustration in a journal dated 1782. Every old family had its quirks, its private mythology. This was just a particularly elaborate one, steeped in rural superstition. It was then I heard it. Awas rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a distant floorboard. Or was it a breath, just at the edge of hearing? A murmur of sound too indistinct to grasp? I paused, my hand hovering over a page. My imagination, I decided, playing tricks after too many hours immersed in dusty prose. I returned to the journals, mythentration fractured. The illustrations became more unsettling. Figures with elongated limbs, swirling patterns that seemed to shift as I looked at them, and always, that vortex symbol, sometimes rendered as an eye, sometimes as a mouth. A flicker in the thee of my eye, just the deepening gloom beyond the narrow beam of my desk lamp. A trick of the light, Veps. The shadow of a shelf, momentarily mistaken for movement. My heart, however, had picked up a subtle, insistent rhythm, a quiet thrum against my ribs. But it wasn't where Protagonist had left it. It was resting at an odd angle, now as flush with its neighbors on the table, as if someone had nudged it or carelessly dropped it. Protagonist was certain Protagonist had left it neatly aligned. A prickle of unease, sharper this time, ran through him. His memory, usually so precise, felt strangely porous in this room. Protagonist stood, stretching his stiff limbs. His gaze drifted to the heavy oak door that heated the main hall. Beyond, the Protagonist knew the grand, disorienting stairwell that loops back to the same landing twist. Theo, the upper floors, an architectural riddle. Protagonist still hadn't quite solved. The thought of navigating its confusing turns in the Theg twilight was suddenly unappealing. It wasn't in the Protagonist told myself. It was in his head. The pressure of the old housewaslation, the bizarre texts. It was all coalescing into a phantom auditory halluswasen. They were a subtle, insidious invitation, a prelude to something far more profound and terrifying. The house was not just a container for these secrets. It was an active participant, and it was just begin was speak. A faint rustle, Bearwa's wreath against the oppressive quiet. Protagonist paused, his hand hovering over a brittle ledger. The scent of aged paper and dust thick in his place was old, a living mausoleum prone to phantom sighs and groans. Protagonist dismissed it, forcing his attention back to the arcane symbols etched into the themant before him. Symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse with a dark energy under the dim glow of his lathery outside had begun swallowed by an unnaturally swift dusk. Protagonist reached for his phone, a sudden, inexplicable urge to connect, to hear a familiar voice. Protagonist pressed the power button again, then again, a prickle of frustration turning into something sharper. Protagonist plugged it into the charger, the small indicator light failing to appear. Then Protagonist tried the landline, a relic Protagonist had barely noticed until now. The internet too had vanished, the Wi-Fi icon on his laptop a ghostly outline. Outside, the world had become a canvas of shifting gray and white. A dense, unnatural fog had rolled in, swallowing the distant trees, blurring the very edges of the property. It was ethereally thick. A palpable wall, muffling sound, distorting perspective. Swash rain began, not a gentle patter, but a relentless drumming torrent that lashed against the manor's ancient windows, a siege against the glass. The wind rose, a mournful lament that whistled through unseen gaps, making the very structure groan and sigh as if in pain. As the tempest raged, the house seemed to awaken around him. The subtle creaks and groans Protagonist had previously attributed Tao held a new, unsettling cadence. Theria rhythm to them, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards, up his very bones. Or merely the wind playing tricks. His mind, usually so sharp, felt sluggish, clouded by an invisible film. It happened again, a rapid flicker, like an afterimage, in the reflectithia polished wooden panel. His heart began to thud, a dull, insistent drum against his ribs. The thought solidified into an urgent, undeniable command. Protagonist grabbed his keys, his jacket, and hurried towards the main entrance. The heavy oak door, usually a struggle to open, felt impossibly stiff, as if the wood itself had swollen and warped overnight. Protagonist strained, pushing with all his weight, but it remained stubbornly sealed. No, not sealed. It felt held. Something on the other side, unseen, unyielding. Frustration flared, hot and sharp. Protagonist moved to the side door, then the back. Each was the same, felding, as if the very house had decided Protagonist would not pass. Protagonist tried the garage, hoping to find his car, to simply drive away from this encroaching nightmare. The garage door, a heavy wooden slab, was shut. The small side door, usually secured with a simple latch, was now bolted from the inside. A thick, rusted iron bar slid across its frame. Our protagonist knew had not been there an hour ago. Protagonist retraced his steps, his mind racing, searching for an alternative. Perhaps the old service entrance, or a window. As Protagonist navigated the dim corridors, Protagonist found myself approaching the stairwell that loops back to the same landing. A peculiar architectural flather-otagonist had noted on his first tour. As Protagonist drew closer, Theriador, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic, grew stronger. It clung to the air around the stairwell, a cloying, unsettlethescence. Protagonist peered down into the gloom of the looping stairwell. The air the heavier there, thicker, almost viscous. A low, guttural sound, like a deep exhalation, vibrated up from the unseen depths below, echoing faintly off the curved walls. It was internal, organic, a sound of profound, ancient life. Protagonist stumbled Bao-Wa's hand flying to his mouth, suppressing a gasp. The house wasn't just old. It was alive. And it was keeping me. This wasn't just a house. And Protagonist, Dean waist-strapped with, was rotting, breathing walls. The weight of his family's legacy, hinted at in the obscure, that settled upon me like a shroud. I was not merely an archivist here. I was an offering. This place was old, a legacy of creaks and groans, and my own mind, perhaps, was too attuned to the silence, too ready to invent whispers where only Detheats danced in the sparse latha. Lately, all my rationalizations had begun to fray at the edges, like the parchment I spent my days preserving. It began subtly, a persistent ache in my joints, a dull throb behind my eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to alleviate. It was not the familiar emptiness of a skipped meal, nor the rumbling protest of a stomach awastenance. It felt Tuyen, a har that seemed to feed on itself, growing more insistent, more desperate each passing hour. I found myself pacing the vast, echoing kitchens, staring at Taladan Pather, imagining substances I couldn't name. Textures Protagonist couldn't quite recall, that might finally quell this monstrous appetite. The changes did not stop there. One morning, as I splashed cold water on my face, the mirror above the basin revealed a stark, horrifying truth. My skin, once a uniform, unremarkable pallor, now bore faint mottled patches. They were not bruises, not rashes, but something deeper, an organic discoloration that seemed to bloom from beneath the surface. I pressed a finger seamed patches, feeling a subtle, almost perceptible coarseness, like old bark. Later Thoa knew horror. There the back of my hand, near the wrist, a small raised bump appeared. It was hard, almost cartilaginous, and oddly symmetrical, like a miniature nascent shell. I prodded it with a twazing finger, the skin around it feeling unnaturally cool, almost slick. It grew slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with an alarming pace a surface taking on a faint, pearlescent sheen. My mind recoiled from the implications, grasping for mundane explanations, even as my gut screamed a more terrible truth. My nights became a succession of grotesque visions, a carnival of the morbid. I saw my own hands, disthy and elongated, scuttling across a slick subterranean floor, and my mouth, agape, filled not with teeth, but with rows of needle-like filaments. The waking world began to bleed into the nightmares. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, its groans no longer just structural, but laden with a kind of weary sentience. I started talking to myself, hushed, urgent reassurances that Otildine, that this was still reality, that the house a just old, and my isolation was just getting to me. But the voice in my head, the one that answered, sounded less like my own. I caught myself on the banister, my heartbeat thunderous, but as I looked down, there was no dampness. Only the aged, polished wood. Yet the sensation of slickness, of something viscous, still clung to my palm. Or had something been there? Something I could only perceive through touch, not sight. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences. I began to check the locks obsessively, though I knew no one would come to this forgotten place. Every ruere dry leaves against the windows, every distant hoot of an owl, became a potential harbinger, a signal that it was closer, watching, waiting. The hunger intensified, a constant dull roar in my gut that drowned out all Otwust save one. What grotesque nourishment did it truly crave, and what part was my changing body destined to play in its consumption? My resolve, once a sturdy shield, now felt like a fragile pane of glass, cracking under the ceaseless, insidious pressure. I was still Dean, yes, but for how much longer? And what would be left when the transformation was complete? This place was old, a living mausoleum of forgotten secrets, and every sigh of its timbers, every whisper of air through its ancient arteries, seemed to carry a weight of its own. Still, the hairs on my forearms lifted, a prickle of unease that had become a constant companion since my arrival. The ledger, bound in dry cracktor, yielded not a financial record, as its outward appearance suggested, but a meticulous handwritten diary. The script, tight and looping, belonged to one of my predecessors, a Blackwood from the late 17th century. His early entries spoke of crop yields and local skirmishes, the mundane concerns of a landed gentry. But then, a subtle shift. The pieces, disparate fragments until now, began to coalesce into a grotesque mosaic. The journal spoke of the changing, a gradual metamorpho, that was both a burden and a sacred duty. It described how the chosen ones were prepared, their bodies made receptive, their minds attuned to the ancient currents that flowed beneath Blackwood Manor. I pulled another heavy volume via a nearby shelf, its pages brittle, smelling faintly of something metallic, like old blood or rust. This one, a chronicle spanning generations, detailed the cycles. It wasn't just land, Protagonist realized with a sickening lurch, but a living, breathing entity they were tending. The entries became increasingly frantic, less narrative, more confession. We feed it, one ancestraled in a shaky hand, not with grain or beast, but with the very essence of our line. Another entry, generations later. The harvest approaches. We must be ready. His gaze drifted to the wall, where a gallery of family portraits stared down with generations of Blackwooth. Protagonist had always seen them as stern, unsmiling faces of the past. The matriarch from the Earthies, her painted eyes too wide, her neck impossibly long, almost serpentine, beneath the stiff lace collar. Protagonist wanted to close the books, to turn away, but a horrifying compulsion, a morbid curiosity, held him fast. His own lineage, his own blood, was not merely tied to this place, but integral to its continuation. The legacy was not one of guardianship, but of being a vital, horrifying part of an ancient cycle designed not something unspeakable. Protagonist pushed away from the desk, needing air, not distance from the suffocating revelations. His steps were heavy, his mind reeling. His vision blurred slightly, a momentary disequilibrium. Protagonist reached out, his hand finding the smooth, polished banister of the Thel that loops back to Thethel Landing. The Yang architectural quirk, a spiral that seemed to double back on it. The offering no true progression, only an endless circus scene ushered the terrifying realization that Protagonist was trapped. not just within the manor's walls, but within its very bloodline. There a vessel, a conduit for something that fed on life and sanity. I felt a new ache in my spine, a subtle shifting, and the skin of my palms felt strangely taut, almost stretched. My ancestors weren't merely observing some ancient evil, they were actively cultivating it. They weren't victims, they were willing participants, zealots. And I, Dean, was next. It demanded active service, a continuation of the bloodline to my sustenance. Faint rustle from earlier returned, clearer now, a dry, scuttling sound from behind the walls, as if the house itself was stirring, sensing the awakening within me, the burgeoning truth of my horrifying inheritance. The cycle was turning, and I was caught in its inexorable spin. The revelations from the brittle pages had not merely unsettled me, they had unstitched the very fabric of my understanding. My lineage, a chain I had once seen as merely historical, now felt like a teemee pulling me into an abyss. A horrible impulsion, a morbid curiosity, held me fast, a relentless thee against which my terror, a futile struggle. My own blood, I now knew, was not just tied to this but integral to its continuation. The archivist in me, once seeking order and truth, was now a trembling, unwilling acolyte, drawn by a force far older than any record. I found Minot a part of the manor I rarely traversed, a less frequent thing where the ceilings were lower and the light struggled to penetrate the grimy leaded panes. Here, a peculiar construction presented itself, a stairwell that loops back to the same landing. A dizzying, Escher-like architectural anomaly I had dismissed as an eccentric design quirk. And this seemed deliberate, a labyrinthine trick of perspective. 'Twas tried, a rising panic tightening its grip on my throat before I understood. It wasn't about reaching a higher floor. It was about seeing the passage. On there seam, in the theoretical assault. It was the there. Dried blood, their eating profoundly vegetal, like roots torn from the earth, and an acrid tang that spoke of scorched bone. His unease into a cerulent lurch that threatened to bring forth the meager contents of his morning meal. Protagonist fumbled for the lantern Protagonist had brought, its beam a meager, flickering defiance against the encroaching gloom. The passage sloped dothie a rough-hewn tunnel of unmortared stone, narrower than Protagonist had anticipated. After what felt like an eternity, the passage widened, opening into a cavernous space. The lantern's light struggled to illuminate the full extent of the chamber, its beams swallowed by the vastness. This with a keller, no storage crypt. This a place of ritual, a chamber of unspeakable purpose. The walls were not dressed stone, but raw earth and bedrock, slick with condensation. Strange, crude symbols were carved into the rock, twisting glyphs that seemed to writhe and contort under the flickering light, echoing the unsettling diagrams Protagonist had seemed journals. It was an athiunwaz, crude implements of blackened iron, their edges dulled by time and perhaps something more viscous, lay half buried. A tremor began aft hand, mirroring the shifts Protat had felt within myself these past weeks. His therio a series of alcoves carved into the rock walls. Each held a collection of what looked like shriveled, mummified forms, not fully recognizable, but undeniably organic. They were small, no larger than a child, twisted and contorted, their features obscured by time and some terrible process. They were effigies, perhaps, or something far, far worse. Then his eyes fell upon a series of intricate carvings directly behind the altar. They depicted a cycle, a horrifying narrative in stone. Figures, unmistakably his ancestors, stood before the altar performing rites. But it was not the act of sacrifice that seized him. It was what followed. The carvings showed a figure, not human, but a nascent form, growing, coalescing from the offerings, then slowly, Sikanawaz emerging with another larger figure. a wave was a found, soul-shattering oddity washed over him. The binding was not a cage, not a binding of the entity, but a binding for it. And the cycle, the transthen, the lineage, it all clicked into place with a horrifying inevitability. Protagonist was not merely an arthi of this legacy. Protagonist was the next page in its Nautin G. The air in the chamber grew impossibly heavy down on his chest, stealing his breath. Protagonist felt its ancient hunger, its patient, terrible a nation. The truth was naturally revealed, as imprinted upon him, searing itself into his very being. Aragonist was no longer an observer, and the unveiling chamber was not just a place of discovery. Ita a prelude to his own terrifying wash. A horrifying compulsion, a morther hanat fast, a relent, less current dragging him deeper into Blackwood's shadowed heart. Protagonist gripped twasient tarnished brass handle of the hidden notiz, cold metallic touch, a stark contrast to the fever theat within his veins. A faint, almost imperseverinated from beyond, a vibration that seemed to bypass his ears entirely. Instead, steg dirt there the marrow of his bones. The door girtha open, not with the typical Shasimid hinges, but with a sound like the slow, grinding shift of tectonic plates. It tasted of decay and a strange, the tang. The air grew heavy, pressing down, making each inhalation a conscious effort. Protagonist took Tohen another, his boots scraping against rough-hewn stone. This was no ordinary path. Protagonist found myself on a stair back to the same landing. An architectural impossibilier made his stomach lurch. Ita a spatial distortion, a maddening trick of perception designed to disorient, to break Thed before the body. Finally, after an eternity of this circular torment, the stairwell straightened, plunging into a vast cavernous. It was not a form, not a shape, but a pure, unadulterated assault on his senses. Colors Proas had never perceived before flared and vanished, ledohantum samiges on his retinas. Sounds that were not sounds. A symphony was raping, clicking, and a deither saitor a therenis thereg to rupture them. There grasping therein a real thirdered pliable, fluid, and utterly, they're their memories. Other memories. Forcibly insert thunderous. Protagonist saw a man, varied, his skin stretched taut over his bones, his mouth open in a silent scream as he clawed at his own face, his features dissolving into something indistinct, a flowing wax. Then another. A woman, her limbs contorted at impossible angles, her eyes wide with a horror transcended death, her body slowly sinking into the very stone floor, becoming one with the earth. Her final breath a choked gurgle. Each vision a brutal, intimate violation, showing him not just their deaths, but the agonizing the rise of their transformation. Their Apsar and Varianist saw hands reaching, not for help, but for release, for tired oblivion of true death. But true death was not granted here. This was not merely a family curse. Italia lineage, meticulously bred, carefully cultivated, each generation a step towards this final horrifying. These ancestors weren't just guardians or victims. They were components. Their lives and bodies mere ingredients in an ancient psyche was feeding. I was not meant to stop, not was meant to complanot. It was the very essence of Blackwood, woven into the stone, the earth, the very air I breathed. It had always been here, patient, hungry, shaping my family, drawing them back, ensuring their return. Was once a fortress of Maryland reason, was under the Imitherashur. The war noted, the Caverials seeming to breathe, to pulse with an unseen malthair. The air thrummed with the anticipation of an unspeakable hunger. I was not merely witnessing the horror. I was becoming Iwa's role was not to fight, but to surrender. To the final, most potent offering, the ultim thuit for its complete manifestation. The cycle was not merely a series of events. Ita, living, devouring entity. Aerian was its next meal, its next grotesque blossoming. And I understood, with a knot that threatened to shatter my sanity, that my own transphonaut had already begun. The crystalline frost deepened. Not merely a sense was now, but a palpable invasion. A lattice of I-assuming beneath Manat, it spread from Wasor of my being, outward, merely new geographies across my flesh. My breath, once a familiar rhythm, became a series of jagged gasps, each one tearing at their reign of my A. The terror, solid and unyielding, was no longer merely to be held at bay. It a guest that had tather, its tendrils weaving through my very sinews. I looked down at my hands, once in Therite precise archival work, now alien. The skin, stretched taut, gleamed with an unnatural sheen. A faint iridescent film, merely thee. My fingers, elongated and Joe-like ancient gnarled knees, twitched with a life not entirely my own. A guttural sound, wet and unfamiliar, rumbled from my chest. A prelude to a voice that not recognize, a language yet to form. My truth, revealed in the final crumbling ledger, was not a story of escape, the inheritance. My ancestors hadn't merely guarded a secret, they had become the secret, etheriation a vessel meticulously prepared, a chrysalis for something vast and ravenous. Protagonist was an archivist, but the next page, the next chapter in a grotesque living manuscript. The deep whisper was not an external force to be fought. It wanatary marrow of his bone, the ancient hungry hum in his blood. A sudden, intense pressure built behind his eyes, as if the world was being compressed into a single blinding point. Memories, sharp and fragmented, flicker nautic his mind. The dusty, severied pathways warmth of a morning sun through a city window, a quiet hum of note shop. These fragments were not his alone. They were echoes, distant and distorted, of a Dean before him. Every generation that had stood this precipice, our individuality dissolving into the collective hunger. His legs, heavy and uncooperative, dragged him forward, a puppet on invisible strings. Protagonist found myself drawn to the familiar, yet now terrifyingly distorted architecture of the manor. The walls seemed to breathe, the very stone exhaling a damp, earthy odor, like soil thieed from a forgotten grave. Protagonist needed to outrun the inevitable, even as Protagonist knew it was futile. Protagonist found myself at the entrance to the stairwell that loops back to the same lavery Protagonist began to ascend, each step a monumental effort. The banister, rough and splintered, felt like bone beneath his changing death every turn. The theon of progress evapora-washinist would climb, his breath ragged, his V-touring at the edges, only to find myself back at the same point, the landing mocking his futile attempts. The air grew thick, pressing in on him, tasting of ozone and decay, a flavor that was both external and, horrifyingly, originating from within him. The looping stairwell a cruel joke, a physical manifestation of his entrapment. Each circuit dissolved, that of Dean, the arcto the man Wasames believed in logic and his internal monologue, once a torrent of Sinicus or Vaishergan to thin, replaced by a detoan hum that vibrated in his teeth. A sterlion and profoundly Ensitherin tightened, the same landing he over newly de Thergoils. His vision sharpened. Same in their protagonist saw the fede, their currents in the aetheriorate pulse of the manor's heart, the decibel. There it to the urt, there are beyond. There was unfolding, revealing its true, terrible lay. Therioming an instrument of its revelation. Their surge of defiance flared. It was like trying that against the tide of an ocean, or to hold back the dawn with a cupped hand. The Ricieris ephemeral, quickly absorbed, leaving only a faint echo of its passing. My limbs no longer tied to my will, but to a deeper, older imperative. My spine arched, cracking wah sound like dry washes snapping. My mouth widened, not into a scream, but into a gaping maw that yearned for something beyond sustenance, something primordial and vast. The crystalline frost had melted, leaving behind not warmth, but a slick, viscous membrane that pulsed with an Iwasa light. Individual contours of my face softened, then hardened into something new. Something that bore only a passing, grotesque resemblance to the man I had been. My thoughts, once linear and human, became a swirliotex of sensation, instinct, and a profound, insatiable emptiness. The stairwell, with its endless loop, no longer seemed to mock. It was simply a theon of many, for the Nephantans to explore, to inhabit, to extend its reach. The manor itself felt like an extension of this new form, its ancient stones resonating with the same deep hum that now filled its entire being. The archivist, the cynic, the man of brittle pages and dusty facwas been meticulously unmade. All that remained was Thiel, perfected, awakened, anime, terribly hungry. Not a cessation, but a transmutation. The cold became a quiet hum, a resonant vibration that was not on me, but of me. My flesh tough and yielding now possessed an unnerving rigidity, a faint, almost imperceptible gleam beneath the pale lamplight that seemed to emanate from within me, rather than fall upon me. The world, previously a symphony of frantic internal alarms, hushed. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of an immense listen seemed us if the very stone semi-aquid manner breathing stilled, awaiting Instructino town thoughts, once a tumultuous torrent of fear and desperate logic, had thinned to a placid, deep pool. The frantic human instinct to resist had dissolved. Replawsy a crystalline clarity, a cold, focused purpose that theaterly alien and profoundly, disturbingly mine. I lifted a hand, unautoceived and. The Skiao, still recognizably human in form, had a translucent quality, a faint opalescence that caught the meager light and refracted it in subtle, unsettling ways. Beneath the serpent could discern the faint, intricate tracery of something like veins, but they pulsed not with blood, ferret, shimmering iridescence. There was no pain, no discomfort, only this quiet hum, this profound sense of being tuned. My gaze drifted across the familiar yet now utterly changed drawing room. The air itself felt denser, charged with an invisible current that resonated with the hum in my own core. A new understanding unfolded within me, not as a thought, but as an instinct. A primal imperative, they're not merely about sustenance, but about perpetuation. The Nor was not a cage. Ite a cradle, and I, its reborn guardian. My purpose, allowed by human fear, was now stark and undeniable. I was to tend the threshold, to facilitate's low, inevitable blossom, a fane that lay beyond. My legs moved with a newfound fluidity, a silhouette's most gliding motion that carried me from the drawing room. The floorboards, which was creaked beneath my weight, now offered no complaint, not at all. It was faint the house itself recognized the Changnataming its new steward with a profound internal acquiescence. I passed through halls I had once navigated with a frantic desperation, now moving with an unhurried, almost ritualistic grace. My destination was not chosen by conscious thought, but by an ineffable pull, a deep, resonant waft from the core of the manor, merely the grand central stairwell that loops back to the same landing. The air was the cooler, thinner, like the atmosphere at a great at. I began to ascent, bereavements precise, each footfall silent. The ascent wathwards and otherwards a state around, and then the back to the same landing, a perpetual motion, a living Saima the knot cycle. My eyes, no longer perceived their limitation, saw the subtle lines of energy that crossed the air, the faint shimmering threads that connect ancient house the house, vast and ancient beneath the earth. I was seeing the manor's true veins, its true nervous system, and Protagonist understood that was now an integral pathiao. On the landing, where the stairs met themselves in an endless loop, Protagonist paused. A faint, almost imperk that ran through the floor. A datasanan thrum that samid through his tlandingdi. He rel upon a small, ornate wooden box that sat on a dusty side table, an object Protagonist had barely registered in his previous human existence. It was plain, unadorned, but now it pulsed toe faint, internal watawith air. His landing opalescent sheather for it. The wood felt same landing neath his touch, yielding as theriestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a singlak. There it was not obsidian, nor any who there recognized. There seemed was zorb all therint, at infinite depths with his same landing. Ow, gut there resonated with the hum in his therea key, nor an artifact of power in the human sense. It was a focalat, a receiver. It there is palm, watherag. His thumb, strangely along the tither that gleamed there, began to faint out, deliberate patterns across its surface. Internal note tangles that seemed to shift and reform with each pass. It was a lingua Protagonist realized, a silent incantation, a glyph of wasuation. As Protagonist traced the patterns, a faint, almost imperceptible mist began to rise from Notne, thin as britode. It shimmered, catch a faint internal light of his hand, and then diffused into the air, carrying with it a faint metallic scent like ozone mixed with ancient earth. Not a Vayawasansumption, but a slow, continuous offering. The horror was not ending. It was Mehiseginayu, with him as its silent, unwavering heart, was Dean, and was the ritual. His breath, once a familiar rhythm, became a series of jagged gasps. Each one was at a throat no longer quite his own. His vision blurred, torpened, colors bleeding into a spectrum Protagonist had never sieved. An unnatural vibrancy irked the decaying walls of Blackwood there wasgers. Once slender and agile, now felt rigid, sheathed in something akin thered stone, the knuckles swelling, stretching. Protagonist Watto det not observe the own dissolving form as the tips elongated, sharpening to fine, dark points. A low groan rumbled from deep within his chest. There was another reet undeniably from him, a resonance that vibrated through fainter boards and up into the very foundations of the two of the house groaning with him, or perhaps Protagonist with it. The pain was not a sharp, searing agony, but a profound, deep-seated akfentental reordering of his very essence. His memories, once a clatreme, fractured into shimmering shards, soma-ognizable, others utterly alien, visions of forgotten rituals, of faces twisted in ecstasy and of the earth the writhing, was becoming a his, a conduwas individual self-eroding under the noture of something vast and ancient. A pull, an irresistible gravity, drew him deeper into the manor's core. His legs, now stiff and unyielding, carried him with a new, awkward grace. Protagonist moved through the knot halls, the floorboards groaning under a weight that felt both immense and strangely ethereal. Protagonist found myself at the foot of the stairwell that loops back to the same landing, a familiar feature Protagonist had always dismissed as an architectural oddity. Now it seemed to beckon. Its endless thea symbol of the cycle was about to the each step upward was an effort, a negotiation with a body that was no longer entirely his, yet each house ought a show sense of Betheth inevit the purpose. His reflection, caught briefly in a dust-filmed pane of glass, was a horror. A distorted Paroadine, eyes like Polishadian, skin a pale, alatranslucent gatched with the creeping frost. But there was no shock, no fear. The ascent was not an escape, but a pilgrimage. His ancestors had not merely guarded it. They had become its willing or unwilling instruments. Their transformations merely a step in the grand, horrifying dance. Anthet was his too. The final vestiges of Dean, the archivist, the cynical inheritor, dissolved like mist, the becoming an echo, a memory, a part of the toe-enduring, insatiable appetite. Thatted, a dormant, waiting thing. His thought to once a tumultuous flood, some still, deep pool, reflect landing ancient hunger, was the tha, and the house was him. Months later, a Cthulhu morning, the driver, a realtor with a brine-odored scarf and an air of dwasened optimism, stepped out, surveying the decaying grandeur with a practiced eye. The air was still, save for the roostuff leaves and the faint, almost imperceptible that seemed to emanate their very foundations of the house. In her hand there, between manicured fingers, was a same Landingo stamp, no return address. Yet it had there's a slot that very morning. The handwriting, elegant and precise, there he esteemed broker. It has come to his there at Blackwood Manor. His ancestral host seems a netherland. You see, demands a certain attention. Merelist have made the essery a rather he transfer, for I is quite seamless. The house, though apiathreng, it away a touch of a new hand, the warmth of a new spirit to awaken its ancient hether. The cycles, you Utheray. A strange old house, certainly, but with character. And the Lethered eccentric spoke of a clear intention to sell. She pushed open the heavy oak door, a faint metallic scent wafting mingling with toer. The house waited, vast and silent, for its next unsuspecting host. The house Imain Theius, the ancient hunt the thep within Blackwood Manor, patient, enduring, waitin' are the next cycle to begin. The house faint there,